Americans explain why 4 hours in a car doesn't count as far. A TV character says his estranged daughter lives nearby, just a 4-hour drive. A European watching that scene burst out laughing, because in a lot of Europe, 4 hours in a car means you've left the country. Today, we're figuring out how nearby can mean two completely different things depending on which side of the ocean you grew up on. And honestly, the answer is bigger than you think. Literally. Here's the reaction that keeps happening. Someone from a smaller country hears an American casually describe a 4-hour drive as not that far, and it genuinely doesn't compute. In some countries, driving 1 hour to visit your mother is already considered a long trip. 4 hours sounds like an expedition. And the response from Americans is almost always some version of, 4 hours? That's basically nothing. Which sounds absurd until you actually look at the numbers behind it. Because this isn't really about attitude. It's about geography that's genuinely hard to picture until someone shows you the scale. Start with this. You can drive for 4 hours in several American states without ever crossing the state line. Not the country, the state. One person described driving 7 hours north and still being in the same state, but only 7 minutes south and crossing into a completely different one. Another pointed out that the halfway point between two major cities on opposite sides of the country is a 12-hour drive, the halfway point. And it's not an exaggeration to say entire European countries would fit inside a single U.S. state with room to spare. The Netherlands, for context, would rank somewhere around the 40th largest state out of 50, smaller than states most Americans have genuinely never had a reason to think about. So once you actually see the numbers, 4 hours stop sounding impressive and start sounding almost modest. There's a reframe that comes up constantly in this conversation, and it's a genuinely useful one. 4 hours isn't nearby in the sense of popping over to borrow a cup of sugar. It's nearby in the sense of family. It means close enough that you don't need to get on a plane to make it home for a holiday, a wedding, or an emergency, but far enough that people aren't just showing up unannounced on a random Tuesday. One person summed it up almost perfectly. It's close enough to drive there and back in a single 16-hour day if you really needed to, but far enough that it's a deliberate decision, not an accident. That distance becomes something close to an unofficial sweet spot for family. Close enough to matter, far enough to have a life of your own. And this is where the stories start getting genuinely ridiculous, because the scale only gets bigger from here. Someone described driving from Texas to California and spending more than half the total trip still inside Texas. Someone else described an 8-hour drive through Nebraska that was just flat cornfields, passing a sign marking the highest point in the entire state, a hill about 3 feet taller than the highway around it. Another person can drive 12 hours in California and still not reach the neighboring state. There's a story about a sheriff in a remote county who pointed out that if he got an emergency call, it could take him over 2 hours to physically arrive, driving at emergency speed. And there's a genuinely wild detail buried in there. Some U.S. national parks and preserves are individually larger than entire countries like the Netherlands. Not the state, the park. Which raises an obvious question. How does anyone actually navigate that scale without losing their mind? The honest answer is, Americans plan differently. And often, visiting family from a different region genuinely blows their mind. There's a running joke about tourists who plan a 5-day American vacation hitting Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, and Miami. Cities that, on a map, look conveniently close together if you've never actually looked at the scale bar. In reality, that itinerary alone would eat most of their trip just in driving or flight time. There's also a genuinely sweet detail that comes up a lot. People whose entire college decision was based partly on driving distance from home. Close enough that going back for a holiday weekend was easy. Far enough that people couldn't just casually drop in on a random Tuesday night. Distance, in America, isn't just a number. It's basically a built-in social filter. Now here's a detail that flips the emotional side of this conversation completely. The exact same close enough logic applies to something a lot heavier than road trips. Multiple people describe being enormously grateful that when a parent had a medical emergency, they only lived a 6 or 8 hour drive away, because the alternative, for some families, is a multi-day trip or a flight across the entire country just to be there for something urgent. In a country this size, 4 to 6 hours isn't just convenient. For some families, it's the difference between being there and not being there. And this cuts both directions socially, too. Plenty of people joke that their in-laws living exactly 4 hours away is precisely the right amount of distance. Close enough to matter for holidays, far enough that nobody's dropping by uninvited on a Sunday afternoon. So here's the part that ties this whole thing together, because this reveals something bigger about how differently two cultures can define the exact same word. Nearby isn't actually a fixed distance anywhere in the world. It's relative to whatever scale a person grew up navigating. To someone raised in a country you can cross in under 2 hours, 4 hours is genuinely far. To someone raised in a country where 4 hours barely gets you out of your own state, 4 hours is a completely reasonable Tuesday. It also explains a very specific kind of confusion that shows up constantly between Americans and international visitors. An American saying, "Come visit, we're not that far," and genuinely meaning it, while accidentally sending a foreign friend on what amounts to a full-day road trip. Nobody's lying, they're just using two different rulers. And honestly, once you understand the scale, a country where you can drive all day and still be in the same state, where entire nations could fit into a single national park, the surprise stops being, why do Americans think 4 hours is close, and starts being, how does anyone in a country this size stay in touch with family at all? The answer, it turns out, is exactly this. They just adjusted what close means. 4 hours became the new 1 hour. And once you're standing inside a country that size, that adjustment stops looking delusional and starts looking like the only sane way to survive the math. If a road trip can genuinely take you longer than a flight to another continent, and Americans still call it close, wait until you see what happens when the same country tries to explain why nobody puts bars on their windows. It's a completely different kind of surprising, and it's coming up next. Drop your longest "that's not far" drive in the comments. I want to see who wins.